In 1984, inside a quiet research building in Moscow, a man sat down at a machine most people in the West had never heard of and began arranging shapes. No investors, no launch strategy, no lawyer waiting to protect the idea. Just a programmer, a puzzle, and a question he could not stop turning over in his mind. What if the pieces never stopped falling? His name was Alexey Pajitnov, and what he built would become one of the most successful video games ever made. According to the Tetris company, Tetris has been sold or downloaded more than 500 million times worldwide. It would move from home computers to consoles, from handheld devices to mobile phones. It would trigger legal fights from Moscow to California, but for years, the man who created it saw no royalties from it. Not because he was not brilliant, not because nobody noticed, but because Alexey Pajitnov created Tetris inside a system that was never designed to let him own it. This is the ownership rift. Pajitnov was a researcher at the computer center of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in Moscow, not a game studio, not a startup, a Soviet state institution. And in that world, the work you did not simply belong to you, it belonged to the structure around you. Pajitnov was fascinated by puzzles. One in particular captured him, a mathematical game called pentaminoise, built around fitting geometric shapes together. On the Electronica 60, a Soviet computer with no color display and very limited power, he began stripping the puzzle down. 5 square shapes became 4 square shapes. Pentaminoise became tetraminoise. 7 distinct pieces, they fell from the top of the screen. The player rotated them, stacked them, and tried to keep the chaos under control. Complete a line, and it vanished. Leave a gap, and it stayed. Every bad placement narrowed the space. Every delay increased the pressure. The game did not reward you for winning. It punished you for losing slowly. That tension, that slow mathematical inevitability, was the genius of it. Tetris did not need a story. It did not need a character. It did not need a world. It just needed gravity and human nature. Colleagues copied it to floppy disks. It passed from office to office. People who were supposed to be working found themselves staring at terminals, stacking blocks until they forgot to go home. And this is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because Tetris became a phenomenon before anyone had properly answered the most important question: who owned it? Pajitnov created Tetris in a system where private software ownership was almost impossible. He later described making a formal 10-year arrangement with the computer center, giving it the rights to exploit Tetris worldwide. In his own telling, that was the easier and wiser path, not because he did not understand the value of what he had made, but because in that Soviet context, personal software rights barely existed. That distinction matters. Pajitnov was not a Western founder choosing between publishers, investors, and lawyers. He was a Soviet researcher working inside a system that gave him almost no practical route to personal ownership. So when he gave the rights to the computer center, it was not simply a bad business decision. It may have been the only realistic path available. That is the whole episode in one idea. A man created one of the most successful video games ever made, and the most reasonable thing he could do was give the rights away. By 1986, Tetris had traveled west. A copy reached Hungary through the SZKY Institute of Computer Studies in Budapest. There, a London-based software broker named Robert Stein saw it. He recognized something extraordinary, and he moved fast, too fast. Stein began negotiating with the Soviet side to secure Western rights. But before everything was fully settled, he had already sublicensed Tetris to Mirrorsoft in Britain and Spectrum HoloByte in the United States. In plain English, he started selling rights before the rights were completely locked down. By January 1988, Tetris was on Western PCs. It shipped with Soviet imagery, red square on the packaging, balalaika music in the background, Cold War mystique wrapped around falling blocks, and it sold massively. But the man who built it received no royalties. The Soviet agency controlling the export of software was called ELORG, short for Elektronorg Technica. It was a state body under the Ministry of Foreign Trade. Not a game studio, not a publisher, a bureaucracy with the power to decide what could leave the Soviet Union. At first, the Western deals moved faster than the Soviet paperwork. Then ELORG began to understand what it was holding. Stein's agreement with ELORG, finally executed in May 1988, covered personal computer rights. But not every machine was a personal computer. Arcade rights were different, handheld rights were different, and home console rights were about to become the center of the fight. The explosive question was simple: did a Nintendo console count as a computer? That ambiguity became one of the most expensive arguments in gaming history. In January 1988, At the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, a Dutch-born publisher named Henk Rogers was walking the exhibition floor when a screen stopped him cold. Falling blocks, simple geometry, a game with no language barrier, no learning curve, and no ceiling. Rogers ran bulletproof software in Japan. He understood markets, he understood hardware, and he understood something else. Nintendo was preparing to launch a handheld system called the Game Boy. That device needed a game anyone could play. Not just children, not just gamers, anyone. Tetris was perfect. So Rogers flew to Moscow. This was not a normal business trip. No glass office, no quick handshake, no clean Western contract process. It was a Soviet licensing bureau where the power sat in the paperwork. Across the table was Nikolai Belikov, the ELORG official at the center of the Tetris negotiations. And what Belikov told Rogers changed everything. The handheld rights were still available. And the console rights that people in the West thought had already been sold were now in serious doubt. Stein had computer rights. Mirrorsoft had sub-licensed from Stein. Atari's gaming division, Tengen, believed it had received the right to release Tetris on Nintendo's home console. But ELORG's position was devastating. Computer rights were not console rights. If Stein never had valid console rights, then Mirrorsoft could not pass them on. And if Mirrorsoft could not pass them on, then Tengen's NES version was built on a broken chain. Not blocks falling, contracts falling. Rogers secured the handheld rights from ELORG and licensed them to Nintendo for the Game Boy. Then he returned to Moscow with Nintendo's Minoru Arakawa and Howard Lincoln. This time, Nintendo secured the console rights directly from ELORG. Handheld first, console second. And now Nintendo had something Tengen did not. A direct deal with the Soviet rights holder. The fight moved to court. In June 1989, U.S. District Judge Fern Smith issued a preliminary injunction blocking Tengen from distributing its NES version of Tetris. Tengen's game had only been on shelves for weeks. Then it was pulled. Cartridges were recalled. Stock was removed. Not because the game was broken, because the rights behind it were. The Game Boy launched with Tetris packed inside. Mario could sell a games machine to children. Tetris sold it to everyone, commuters, parents, office workers, people who had never cared about video games before. Suddenly they could not stop playing. According to official Tetris materials, the Game Boy version sold well over 35 million copies. And through all of it, the sales figures, the headlines, the cultural explosion, Alexey Pajitnov watched the world fall in love with his game. But he would not see a penny. This is the part people often flatten. They say, Pajitnov got nothing because of communism. That is not wrong, but it is too simple. And it lets the real lesson slip away. Pajitnov was not dragged into a room and robbed at gunpoint. He made a rational decision inside a system that gave him no better option. That is the more chilling truth. Because systems like that do not only exist in the Soviet Union. A university can own your thesis. A record label can own your masters. An employer can own the code you wrote. A platform can own the audience you built. The structure around the creation can become more powerful than the creation itself. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. Was Pajitnov a victim of the system? Or did he make the only rational choice available? He described the 10-year arrangement as easier and wiser. But if the system gives you no real alternative, is that still a choice? Tell me where you stand. And if you know another story like this, a creator, inventor, artist, or founder who built something valuable before they truly owned it, tell me in the comments. Because this story is not just about Tetris. It is about every creator who builds something valuable before they understand who owns it. In 1996, the 10-year arrangement finally expired. Pajitnov and Rogers built the Tetris company together. For the first time, the man who invented Tetris began to earn from it. More than a decade after he created it. Today, the rights sit with Tetris Holding. The Tetris company administers and licenses the brand. According to the Tetris company, Tetris has been sold or downloaded more than 520 million times worldwide, and the man who made it, on a machine most people had never heard of, in a quiet Moscow office in 1984, had to wait more than a decade to receive royalties from it. Creation is not ownership. Tetris is not just a game about falling blocks. It is a story about what happens when the world discovers your idea before you control the rights to it. The blocks keep falling. The question is, whose name is on the paper beneath them?